This presentation will address the multi-agency public safety response to a post-blast incident. And as we've seen historically within the United States, explosives is the #1 choice for terrorists. This also continues to be a current and emerging threat that responders may have to deal with. A rapid, safe, and successful response to one of these incidents does require some planning and preparation amongst the agencies. The likelihood of a terrorist or criminal explosive incident is still low, but public safety officials do need to plan and prepare for these incidents. Recent incidents, both within the United States and overseas, have definitely demonstrated the need for local, regional, state, county, federal, and military resources to plan for and prepare for these types of attacks. Our goal is to prepare first responders, emergency management, and other public safety officials with some very basic tools and guidance to plan for these incidents. #1, if you have a plan, it might be a good idea to update that plan. And #2, if you don't have a plan, we want to develop that plan. Also, it's very important to remember there has been a history of the use of explosives within the United States, all the way back to the extremist use of explosives in the 60s and 70s, Oklahoma City, the first World Trade Center bombing, also recent events such as Times Square and the Christmas Day bomber. All these events have shown us this threat is still present. The guidelines and procedures discussed in this presentation should not replace common sense and experience. All our experience with dealing with different incidents will help you manage a post-blast response. It's also, from a planning standpoint, impossible to plan for every single situation. So it's important to have a basic plan with the basic fundamentals, and that'll help you manage and coordinate any response. Also, there are new best practices, lessons learned, training, and intelligence that's out there that's available on an ongoing basis. So if you did training 5 years ago, it's probably time to update that training effort and look at the new, current, and emerging threats. The criminal and terrorist explosive threat is just not a threat for major metropolitan areas. Even in rural areas, you may be exposed to this threat when involved with methamphetamine drug labs, indoor or outdoor marijuana grows, or other situations where responders could be exposed to explosives. Please remember that this information that we're discussing today should only be used as an educational guide, and should always use your local guidelines, procedures, and training for these type of responses. Again, if you have an older plan, take this information and let's update it, or if we don't have a plan, let's go ahead and build a plan. It definitely appears in today's world that the bad guys, whether criminal elements, terrorists, or any other threat, are more determined, violent, and heavily armed than ever before. So crisis situations such as terrorist threats, criminal attacks, bomb threats, explosives threats, homemade explosive labs, these are going to be occurring with an alarming frequency. It's also important to remember that no two explosive incidents are ever the same. Factors ranging from the bomber's motive, the type of explosive materials they're using, knowledge of the location or target, the number of victims in the area, the number of public safety resources in the area will all influence the outcome of an explosive incident. A large majority of terrorist attacks around the world utilize explosives. Explosive devices can consist of anything from homemade explosives, HME, improvised explosive devices, IED, to sophisticated military ordnance. But typically, first responders will encounter homemade explosives, the HME, and improvised explosive, the IED, in their day-to-day response activities. Again, it's important to remember, because of the homemade explosives and the IED component, that every community, large or small, can see this material being developed and built in clandestine labs in their community. Since 2001, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security have sent several intelligence and public safety warnings and bulletins to first responders across the United States, warning about the threat of improvised explosive devices. It's important when law enforcement agencies receive this type of information and intelligence that it is shared across the board with all other public safety agencies. One of the emerging threats that we need to be aware of in the United States is due to the narco-insurgency in Mexico. In the past 24 months, there have been at least 7 to 8 car bombings in Mexico as a result of the narco-insurgency and the guerrilla warfare. Some of these explosive attacks have been within 1 or 2 miles of the United States border. So there is the potential that we could see the spillover violence in the United States. We have already seen in the United States violence occurring as a result of the ongoing conflict in Mexico. Also, there are several organized crime elements that have connections with the criminal element in Mexico. So again, this does mean this could be a current and emerging threat within the United States. Another example of a current threat within the United States is the Times Square VBIED, the vehicle-borne IED threat that occurred on May 1st, 2010. This incident was initially dispatched as a vehicle fire. Upon arrival, the fire department, using their on-scene indicators and situational awareness, were able to safely identify it as a car bomb. And thus, the teams working together were able to neutralize that threat very safely. Some of the on-scene indicators that the firefighters were able to pick up on in New York City, number one was very dense white smoke that their experience showed them was unusual. There were also unusual popping noises coming from the vehicle. The third tool that they used, and I would highly recommend, was their thermal imager. They turned the thermal imager on to visualize the vehicle and picked up on several unusual indicators, which at the time helped them make the decision that they were dealing with a V-bed. Post-blast or post-detonation response is the response that takes place immediately after an explosion, big or small, has occurred. An explosive attack or explosive event definitely has the potential to overwhelm local first responders due to the large numbers of victims, fatalities, fires, and property destruction that would result from that explosion. The purpose of this presentation is to provide some very easy to follow guidelines and procedures for both first responders and incident commanders responding to a post-blast response. Typically, for first response agencies, their explosives response plan will only address bomb threats and suspicious packages, and not the actual response to an actual detonation. So again, these will provide you some tools to plan for that unfortunate event once it occurs. As with any critical incident response, try to get all the dispatch information available to you, even though this information may not be correct. The nature of the call and the location are very important. The pre-arrival information will be very important. Is this a high population density area? Is it a federal courthouse? Is it a 911 center? Is it a jail? Is it a school? It'll depend on what the location is and what type of threat that you may have, but an explosive incident can occur at any of these locations. The standard guidelines against the use of radios and cell phones for a suspicious package or a bomb threat are not applicable to this type of response because you've had an actual detonation and there are fatalities and injuries. There will be an overriding need for a very rapid and coordinated response. This is the only way that you can safely and successfully manage this incident. If possible, try not to use radios within 150 feet of the blast site or the seat of the blast site, and use other resources such as runners in the hot zone to try to avoid using the radios too close to the blast site. But again, you will need to use radios and cell phones to have a safe and coordinated response. Some of the arrival on scene items that you'll have to manage. Number one, please proceed with caution for your own safety when approaching the incident. If possible, approach from upwind and uphill, but again, this will be dependent upon the situation and the terrain. We don't know what's in the smoke, so we try to avoid the smoke from an explosive incident. Also, slow down when approaching the area and conduct that 360-degree scan of the situation. Don't get tunnel vision just on the blast. We need to do that when we're conducting our windshield survey for several reasons, including we're getting a complete image of what happened and we're able to report to all the other incoming units on what's happened and what we're seeing. As a responder or an incident commander, it's very important to use at least one staging area or even multiple secured staging areas. This will keep resources from stacking up in one location because again, we have to consider secondary devices, secondary threats. So you should consider multiple secured staging areas. Also, from a command and control standpoint, if I have a staging area established, at any given time I know how many police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, bomb squad, and other resources will be in the staging area, and we can make that decision to pull those resources in. Also, law enforcement, when the incident occurs, needs to immediately disperse any crowds that are forming and begin attempting to set up some type of perimeter. As with any crisis situation, it's very important to rapidly implement the Incident Command System, or ICS, and those necessary components that you do need, such as unified command, a safety officer, operations. All this will depend on the size and scope and scale of the incident, but you do need to establish the Incident Command System so all the multiple agencies can work together. Also, from a response standpoint, if possible, avoid entering the blast impact area, or what we can call the hot zone, unless it's absolutely necessary to save lives, and we only do this when it's possible. If it's very obvious at the seat of the blast or the blast impact area there are no viable victims, then responders do need to stay out of that immediate area. As with any critical incident, responder safety is always our #1 priority. Number one, we need to be reminded with explosive attacks or any type of terrorist attack that responders can be a target, and we need to keep that in mind during the response. Also, we need to maintain our situation awareness. Who's around us, what's going on, what's happening with the scene, and what's going on around the scene. Because again, responders can be the primary target. So some of the ways we can help manage that threat: check the immediate area for secondary devices and threats. Check your command post location, check your staging areas, your triage areas for secondary devices and threats. Also, all responders should wear all appropriate level of personal protective equipment, or PPE, at all given times. If all you have is a hard hat and a non-rebreather mask, then wear a hard hat and a non-rebreather mask. Okay, so let's utilize all the personal protective gear that we can, because as we can see, even to this day, we have responders that have been impacted by the health hazards from 9/11. If an explosive device has detonated, there is the very high likelihood and the consideration we need to maintain of a secondary device. A secondary device are bombs that are placed at the scene of an ongoing emergency response that are specifically intended to cause death and injury among responders and bystanders. We have seen this in the United States, and there's a good chance we will see it again. We need to establish hazard control zones around the incident. This is very similar to the hazardous material response with your hot, warm, and cold zones. The blast site, or the seat of the explosion, will be your hot zone. This is where the actual detonation took place. Also, as responders, it's important to remember that we need to keep escape routes open for both personnel and vehicles if it's necessary to evacuate the scene very quickly if needed. This could be because of other secondary threats, secondary devices that are found, or even items such as leaking gas lines or other threats. The response to a post-blast scene is very similar again to a hazardous material response. Use your zones of control. The hot zone is where the blast took place and damage and injuries will occur. The warm zone is the area where you'll set up your perimeter area and clear that area. The cold zone is where we'll have our unified incident command post, staff, resources, triage, and staging areas established. So remember our zones of control: hot, warm, and cold. Trained bomb technicians and explosive canines should search for secondary devices and threats during the response, if possible, and after the response. Our normal response on suspicious packages and bomb threats is bomb technicians will not search. But when you've had an actual detonation and the higher level of threat of some type of explosive threat or material, bomb techs need to help secure that scene. If you have an actual detonation or attack, you need to notify the appropriate agencies as soon as possible. This could be fire, EMS, law enforcement, your bomb squad, emergency management, and even remember to notify the hospitals. They should all be notified as soon as possible after the incident so they can start their plans and preparation to manage this. It's very important to include hospitals either locally or regionally in your planning and preparation, because in a lot of incidents that have actually occurred, hospitals will only find out about the incident when the first victims show up at the hospital. So if you can give your hospitals 5 to 10 minutes to prepare internally for the disaster, that will go a long way along with saving lives. A post-blast explosive response does have the potential to generate a large number of victims with very traumatic injuries, and the communities will need to prepare for that. Also, we will need to rapidly coordinate with law enforcement, both locally, county, state, federally, to prioritize what's called force protection. And that means protecting the responders and the response. So we'll have to put force protection and resources around those areas critical to the operation and the scene. Also, an important response tactic to remember is you have to search beyond the immediate blast scene. Victims can be impacted down the street or even 2 blocks away from the blast. This is especially important in areas that have dense urban environments, where you may have victims that were injured in the upper stories of buildings 3 blocks over. They could be injured or have medical conditions. So all this can be implemented immediately, but we have to consider that because it takes a lot of resources to search the immediate area. Not only will you have those directed or impacted directly from the blast, receiving injuries from the blast, but if they have underlying medical conditions such as asthma or heart problems, those problems may kick in, which will increase the number of medical victims that you'll have to manage. Some of the seriously injured victims from a post-blast response may have no visible wounds, and some victims may even be beyond help. One important thing we need to remember is those victims need to be removed from the scene as quickly as possible. Quickly remove the victims from the area and render aid in a safe, secure location. Triage typically will be conducted away from the blast scene due to the hazard of unexploded ordnance, secondary devices, fires, and other threats. So remove the victims from the danger area to a more secure location. This can be done with backboards, litters, skeds, or other movable devices. Normal stretchers out of the back of an ambulance may not be usable in this environment due to the debris, dust, fire hose lines, and other material that may be blocking the path. So these victims may have to be carried, which is manpower intensive. If you're limited on manpower initially, which you may be, it's okay to grab civilians, tell them what to do to help move those victims out of the immediate blast area as they are self-evacuating away from the scene. EMS, BLS, Basic Life Support, and ALS, Advanced Life Support, may need to implement their county or regional or local disaster procedures, such as utilizing tactical medics, triage tags, casualty collection points, and field treatment areas for very minor injuries. This avoids you with overloading the hospitals with minor injuries when they need to manage the traumatic and burns and other type of serious injuries. Also, locally, you may need to implement your local mass casualty disaster plan and even your mass fatality plans as soon as possible. With triage is typically going to be conducted twice in a disaster situation. Once at the scene and once in the hospital. This may be done multiple times at both locations. Also, from a response and planning standpoint, biohazard issues will need to be addressed, as there is a lot of blood and tissue visible and present at these scenes. So you may have to have field decontamination taking place for responders and investigators. We need to expect numerous types of injuries, including traumatic injuries, blast pressure injuries, internal injuries, crush syndrome, burns, fragmentation, and shrapnel. You can have a wide variety of injuries occur from a small blast. Also, responders need to immediately start monitoring for other hazards such as chemical agents, gases, and radioactive materials. This is a good mission for your hazardous materials team to conduct as soon as possible because we don't know what other hazards are present either on the scene or in the smoke, dust, and debris. Also, again, first responder is always important, so we want to try to identify and prevent secondary injuries to both responders and the public due to falling pieces of glass from broken windows, from upper stories, debris from other buildings. So one way we can do that is utilizing that personal protective equipment we've talked about. From a fire department response standpoint, if vehicle or structural fires are involved, firefighters should rapidly knock down the fire while preserving evidence if possible. But life safety is very imperative, and that needs to be the focus on firefighting operations. The incident commander must decide whether the fire operations should be offensive or defensive in nature during the response. Responders should attempt to approach the scene from upwind if possible as even small explosions can generate a significant amount of smoke, dust, or debris. Firefighters during firefighting operations should wear complete turnout gear and SCBA. As you're responding, you will need to consider other specialized assets such as USAR or Urban Search and Rescue teams, hazardous material teams, tactical teams, incident management or overhead teams, all the other specialized resources that may be required to manage a large-scale incident. During your scene operations, you'll need to consider some of the other secondary hazards, such as electrical lines down, gas lines that have been disrupted water mains, the streets may be flooded. All these type of situations can occur and can create a hazard for responders. Family and friends may immediately converge on the scene, so consider initiating a family assistance center due to the impact of this event on our community. A family assistance center is a location where family members and friends will receive information on the wounded and deceased. Also, after disconnecting utilities, lighting of the scene is necessary in order to enhance the evacuation of casualties and post-incident investigation by law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement will need to respond to the hospitals as evidence can be recovered from both victims living and dead. Fire departments should not conduct salvage and overhaul and cleanup operations until coordinated by the law enforcement investigative authorities. When you have the response, you need to make immediate notifications of local, state, and federal agencies and resources that can provide you with support. In a smaller community, a larger community with a large event, or a small event, any explosive blast incident is going to be an extensive multi-day crime scene and investigation. Immediate interagency cooperation can be established using the incident command system and unified command, and this will be essential to a safe and successful response. Clear communications, both personal and radio, will be necessary to have an effective response. If you have access to helicopters, this is an excellent tool to provide you an overhead assessment and overhead security during the scene. Clear communications can be established during a response by all the agencies utilizing the incident command system and avoiding freelancing. Establish as large a crime scene perimeter as possible. The rule of thumb for the perimeter is to extend the perimeter 50% from the farthest piece of evidence located. If you have an incident and you find a piece that is 100 yards away, you will extend that perimeter another 50 yards away from that farthest piece of evidence, and that will give you your initial perimeter that needs to be established and secured. We also need to ensure that the responders preserve possible evidence that they will come across for subsequent criminal and forensic investigations. As far as evidence goes, if you find what you think is an important piece of evidence, please don't pick that up and bring it to law enforcement or the command post. Or if you find a critical piece of evidence, but you need to conduct life-saving rescue operations, take a picture of it, mark the area where the evidence was at if it needs to be moved, and effect those life rescues. During an explosives response, a large number of pieces from the explosive device or the bomb can be found. So this will be very important during the response and the investigation. One important aspect that we do need to plan for is the intensive media response that you will have to any type of explosion that occurs. So we need to appoint at least one PIO or public information officer as soon as possible to handle the immediate media response that will arrive on scene. Also, the crime scenes may be limited to a small area such as a single residence or a single business, or can extend for several blocks. With today's social media aspect, the role of a public information officer will be critical, as the media coverage will now be extended to 24/7 coverage until the response has ended. One important ICS tool or incident command system tool that can be utilized in the first few minutes of any major incident, including an explosive incident, is the ICS 201 form. This is referred to as the incident briefing form. Why this is important: it allows you as the responder incident commander to gather all the important information that you need to be able to provide briefings, provide information, and help you make some decisions. This includes a scene map or sketch, a situation summary of what's happened up to this point, What are your current and planned objectives for the next few hours? What current plan, action, strategies, and tactics are we utilizing right now? Who is on the scene from an organizational position? And what resources or a resource summary do we have? The 201 form can be filled out within 2 or 3 minutes and can be shared when a new incident commander comes in, when you're providing briefings, and can help you manage the response. A 201 form can be found even by going to Google and searching an ICS 201 form. You can have an electronic version or even a written version. What this slide visualizes is what a unified command organizational setup would look like for an explosive incident. As you can see within the unified command leadership, we have a representative from Fire Rescue Department, a law enforcement representative, and an EMS representative. You will also see multiple public information officers that are working together to put out the same message. You will need to assign a safety officer for the scene. Your emergency management can assist you as your liaison officer, and all the other agencies will fit into this ICS organizational structure as agency representatives. So what this leads us to is speaking with one voice. It's important to remember under unified command, those lead incident commanders can shift roles and responsibilities. Initially during the response, it could be the fire rescue incident commander who's in charge during fire and rescue. If that transitions into a mass casualty, EMS agency becomes the lead agency within that unified command. Once that response shifts into recovery investigation, law enforcement will move into the lead agency in unified command with fire and EMS supporting them. If you have an explosives incident or any critical incident response, your local emergency operations center or EOC should be activated as soon as possible for the long-term response, recovery, management, investigative, local, state, and federal support efforts that will all be going on. These responses can go on for days and weeks. The recovery investigation can go on for even longer. So your EOC is a secured location with phone lines, fax lines, television, and all the other resources you need that would provide an adequate location for this effort to take place. Also, due to the media aspect, your Joint Information Center, or JIC, should be established as soon as possible, involving all the key agencies and all their public information officers, because this response will become national and international news immediately. Some of the secondary activities that may be taking place is the establishment of that Family Assistance Center. That will need to be at a site that is secured and remote from the incident. This is where the family members will meet with counselors, clergy, and investigators. The media is not allowed in or near a Family Assistance Center. We will also need to establish helpline phone numbers, because everyone from the United States will be trying to call into your community from a news and family aspect, so you will need to establish additional phone lines to manage that load. One consideration that's very important is CISM, or Critical Incident Stress Management, for the responders, and that opportunity should be provided to them whether or not they want to participate in that effort. One emerging threat is the threat of suicide bombers. If a suicide bombing incident occurs and the suspect is neutralized, but there is no explosion, do not render aid to the suspect. The suspect may only be injured, and a handler or associate of the suspect could still detonate the device as responders are approaching him. The bomb squad personnel or the bomb squad robot should be the first to approach a bomber or a suspected bomber doing a suicide bombing incident. We also need to be aware of the possibility of secondary devices in attacks during a suicide bombing incident, because these events have specifically targeted first responders. During the suicide bombing response, even if a bomb itself fails to detonate, the initiator, possibly a blasting cap or caps, may still detonate. This can happen because blasting caps are typically improvised or homemade for these suicide bombing devices. You will still hear a very loud bang and see the presence of smoke. The potential bomber may be severely injured and probably moving around on the ground and or calling for help. The bomber is still a very real danger to both the community and the responders. They may have a secondary means to detonate the device, they may have a handler, and should still be considered an imminent threat, so we need to treat them accordingly. Again, Bomb squad personnel or a bomb squad robot should be the first to approach a bomber or suspected suicide bomber. Two excellent resources for responders to look at is the DHS Live Explosive Training for Responders, which the link is provided, and the Department of Homeland Security Office of Bomb Prevention Tripwire website, which provides current intelligence and information on explosive threats. Both these websites have been provided on the slide. Preparation is the key to a terrorism incident, and that includes a very clear idea of your actions before the incident occurs. The first step in your preparation for responding to this incident or any other type of incident is a review of your agency's guidelines and procedures. One way we can test your plans once they're in place, as we do with any multi-hazard assessment and planning process, it's a great idea to do some type of multi-agency exercise. This can include a tabletop exercise or a full-scale or functional exercise where all the agencies will come together and work through the response. Again, it's very important to test these plans and rehearse these plans before you implement them. On this slide, you'll see two different bomb threat standoff distance charts that were made available to you. These charts provide responders with some very basic information. If you have a suspicious package, a bomb threat, or an actual incident, will help you make some decisions on how far your perimeter and your evacuations should take.